Thank you very much for attending the third of our creative history in the classroom sessions. And we've got 4 great papers that are going to take us from the national to the global, to the digital to the analog. And I'm really excited to be thinking more about how we expand the history classroom itself in thinking about creativity. So if you want to have your cameras on, then please do. It's always nice for presenters to feel that there are people present and here, but don't worry if you can't. We've also got somebody called Josh, who is going to be drawing our papers and live illustrating them, so you can kind of get a visual kind of like prompt as people speak through their papers. Our first paper is going to be from Jill and Zoe, both of whom have come from I've lost my notes. Both of whom have come from Middlesex University, and they're going to be talking to us about walking and house history. So I don't know if you want to start uploading your slides.
Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
Great. So I'm Zoe Hendon, and I'm head of collections at the Museum of Domestic Design and Architecture. So I work with colleagues across the university. The museum is part of Middlesex University, and Jill's going to quickly introduce herself too.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for that, Zoe. So my name's Jill Stewart. I am an environmental health practitioner by background, and I teach all of the housing elements on that degree. I also teach public health students. So I've worked closely with Zoe and her colleagues over at MODA. I'm particularly interested in house histories and how we can help to bring that to life for our students. So we've done various things together, but today we're going to talk about something we've been working on and developing these past few months in particular, about a walking tour through Hendon. Thank you, Zoe. So can we go on to the next slide, please?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so this initiative really started off a few years back now, and I've been interested to try to bring some practice into our students' learning experience. So what I'm very aware of with my students is some of them are interested in housing and some of them are not. And so one of my challenges is to try to engage with students to make housing interesting for them. Some of the students have to understand things like how to age housing, how to understand housing deficiencies, how to put them right, and so on. And this has come at a time when a lot of the practice experience our students need has been lost. So many of our students in the past would have worked with local authorities, for example, to do practical training for up to a year of a 4-year degree programme. And we've lost all of that in recent years. So we've been looking at all sorts of ways we can help engage with students and how we can try and teach and show them that they at some point will have their own area they're responsible for, perhaps sort of a local authority area, and we're trying to as well to help students to understand how they then go on to understand their own area that they're working in and the changes there have been. So we started off some years ago with a PDF and a few questions, as you can see there, and this was immediately quite successful, and students really seemed to enjoy it as a part of their 12 weeks of study on a particular module. So we based this on a photo voice type method to ask students to go around, take pictures of things they found interesting, to capture that and bring it back into the classroom that we could then discuss. Some of the initial and very informal feedback suggested that many students had looked at places in a different way than before. For example, they were looking up at flats above shops, or they were looking at plaques on places to understand the age, or looking at street names to try and understand where some of the names and histories had come from. So we also teach law. So we were trying to understand how we could better introduce this and some other concepts in a way that wasn't just classroom based, that was more alive and more practical. And part of this exercise was not just look at the housing, but to look at the local environment and see where there might be possible interventions and how we could understand that. So on this initial PDF, we had a link to a few sources for people to understand the Hendon area a little bit better, but also just some questions to nudge them we could then bring back into the classroom to discuss further. So could we have the next slide, please, Zoe?
Yeah, so just to continue those thoughts from Jill, we were keen to bring the idea of the arts into what is actually a science subject. So these are not history students, but we're trying to make house history relevant to them and to quite a mixed group of students. So Jill and I have worked together a number of times, as she mentioned, including Jill wrote a blog for us for our website, and we did a live tweeting session for House History Hour, I think earlier in this year, and we'll add the links in the chat in a minute. So just to, do you want to speak about this one, Jill?
Yes, okay. So Hendon is a North London suburb. It developed rapidly, and we can see some of the changes on our walking tour. It's got a real mixture of different types of housing, and we were trying to help students to understand, even just within a short walk from the campus, how different the housing was and what this was telling us about the history and how Hendon had developed as an area. So we're trying to help them to think more widely and look to other areas as well as to how they can find research and other resources. And this way has proved quite important for that. So I'll pass back to you, Zoe, for this slide.
Yeah, just to say, we wanted to get students to think about their surroundings in a different way. As Jill has explained, they need to be looking at housing and aware of housing in a professional capacity, but we wanted to get them participating in active learning in the open air and learning by doing and looking and discussing rather than looking at PowerPoint in a classroom. There's obviously lots of pedagogical literature to suggest that walking itself promotes learning, but nothing really written that relates to this kind of walking tour for undergraduates. So we were kind of slightly making it up as we went along. And as I say, these are not history students, but we wanted to encourage them to think about an awareness of the past and to think about issues around housing and health and how they relate to the present. So we initially started to plan this around the idea of using an app called GeoTourist, and you can have a look at this online. It seemed like a really good idea to make this into an audio walking tour, but it turned out that GeoTourist is rather less user-friendly than it initially appeared. So we ended up doing it on paper, so giving students the instructions on paper. And in fact, I think perhaps this removed a potential barrier to participation because nobody was required to use a phone to download anything or use their data or whatever. We designed the route to take in different types of housing and to be achievable in about an hour. We sent them off in groups of 4 and 5, asked them to allocate roles to themselves. So I said, perhaps one of you could be the navigator in charge of making sure you're going in the right direction, someone else to take photographs, and other people responsible for thinking of good questions to ask when you get back. And the instructions we gave them were asking them to do several things at once. So the instructions were partly directions, how to navigate around the streets, instructions, so what to look at and why, and questions to be thinking about. We hope that asking students to work in groups would enable them to pool their existing knowledge and to identify what they didn't know and that they should therefore find out when they got back. And we're also asking them to observe things, so to look closely at the details of buildings for various different reasons.
What I have found, certainly since working at Middlesex University, and this is my 7th year now, is how rapidly the area has changed. And thankfully, I've taken quite a lot of photos since I've been at Middlesex of the area, which was pretty new to me as well. So on the photo on the left here, I don't know whether you can read the date plaque. I believe it's 1854, and this property was still occupied at that point. So obviously date plaques are really helpful for us to try and get an indication of the age of a property, and therefore the type of conditions and some of the deficiencies we might expect to see there. So I'm glad I've got this photo, because that property is no longer there. And as you can see, it's been replaced now with a much higher density block of flats, with less green space around it, and additional environmental issues that we need to think about, things like parking and so on, and amenities. So this helps as well for students to see this rapid change, and we can talk them through this on the tour as well. Many of them will be dealing with things like planning applications as well, so they can help to give recommendations on some of the planning applications about the health and housing issues they might come across. There's also another place we asked them to stop, which is actually was a property guardian place in the past. So we can also as well nudge them to try and find out a bit more about property guardianship, which has become particularly important in environmental health and housing conditions. So we're looking not just at the property, but as I mentioned at the beginning, the wider issues of what's happening in an area. So moving on to this one, some areas obviously developed very rapidly during the 30s. Hendon did, but the part of the tour and the area we're in, there's not much by way of 30s housing. Myself and Zoe have been along to the Manor Hall estate. This is a very middle class area of suburbia, very large, grand 1930s properties, and the Motor Archive keeps lots of resources on places like this, but it was a fraction too far really to ask our students to walk to, being on the other side of the main A1 into London. However, we have got one street, and again this is helpful to us because students could have a look around this and think about some of the issues, things like why properties by them would have had an inside bathroom, for example, some heating provision, and hot and cold water and so on, things that houses slightly older may not have benefited from. Now tonight, by chance, we mentioned House History Hour. There will be a session on interwar suburbia. So
yeah, that's on Twitter at 7 o'clock.
Sorry.
Yeah. So students generally enjoyed the walk, and they hadn't thought about what could be learned by walking around and looking at things. So we were lucky also that we happened to do this on a very lovely day. So that was, fortunate. The feedback was generally positive and prompted interesting discussion about housing types, housing defects, and things that students wanted to find out more about. Some said that they wanted more information, but we kind of encouraged them to look it up rather than expecting to be told everything. This was only an hour's walk around a very small area. So while we could have perhaps provided more historical context, we also thought that this was an exercise in sort of whetting their appetites and hoping that they would find out more themselves.
So we've been quite sort of happy with some of the informal feedback and comments that we've had over a period of years now, having done this. But what we wanted to do for this and for presenting today was just to try to capture quite informally some of the comments that students had from doing this for the first time. Obviously, bearing in mind that we've all been kind of cooped up with COVID for a couple of years. We're trying to look at new and interesting ways to teach and learn. We've learned, myself and Zoe have learned massively from this about the Hendon area and some of the housing and its histories. So it's been very interesting for us to do for all sorts of reasons, but we wanted to find out what the students thought about it. And we were, I think it's fair to say, pretty overwhelmed with how positive they were about it. And you can see here what they were saying. So we collected some feedback from students with a very, very quick anonymous survey at the end of the session. And these comments really helped us to understand what students thought of it. And some of the comments were that it was surprisingly enjoyable. And one of them, my favourite comment, I think, was, "I would do all classes in this way." And I think I would like to as well. So on this slide, we've got some more comments here. So I think students were quite surprised at how varied the housing was and how much they could learn, not just about housing, but what it taught them about the history of the area as well, as a very active learning process about housing as history. Some of them were quite, I think, upset and unsettled by some of the properties they saw, but in their professional practice, they will be very frequently looking at some very poor quality properties and some very distressing situations as well. So this as well is quite a helpful way in for them. Not surprisingly, many students said they just walked past and hadn't noticed so many of these places before. And they were surprised at some of the properties they did see. So let me move on to the next slide. Thank you, Zoe.
So we, as Jill says, we both learn a lot about local history and about new technology, and we challenged ourselves to new things. And I think that I was pleased to see that students kind of rose to the challenge of doing this and learning in a new way. And as we've said, the feedback was great and better than we could have expected. And we think that this could easily be adapted to other subject areas. And we're be interested in exploring that ourselves. I suppose one question that was raised in the student feedback is about accessibility. We did rely on the fact that all students were able-bodied and were able to get out and walk around. I'm not sure how we would facilitate this learning experience for students with mobility issues, so that might be something we need to think about. We could perhaps devise different routes. Colindale is like the next tube stop up, and there are some interesting housing points to note around that area, so we could perhaps devise another route. And we could perhaps get geotourists to work next time if we thought that would actually be an advantage for students. So those are all interesting things to think about for next time.
And really, just to sum up, we wanted to think a little bit about impact. We've mentioned some of the comments before. Even with the PDF-based tour I mentioned right at the beginning, some students really enjoyed that and that process, but we did want to develop that, and we feel that we have come along quite a long way in our thinking and the experience we offer our students. What I've found as well, having had the students now for a few weeks since this tour, is that I've been able to say and refer back to places such as the blocks of flats that some people are now thinking about in their coursework, for example, and it seems to have triggered some ideas and some thoughts. So we worked hard on the trip to try and find houses of different types, of different ages, that could really help inspire and whet students' appetite. So this has been really helpful for me to draw examples. And students have had these places and the location and the situation and how it felt in their mind. That's also an important part of teaching housing. Some were particularly interested in things like the almshouses, which are literally opposite our campus. They raised real questions, and students were really surprised how old some of the properties were. They were also particularly interested in the blocks of flats they could see, and we positioned the tour so that they could see the flats in a distance. And students commented that they wanted to learn more literally on every stop they made, which was fantastic. So we're going to come back to this again and ask students at the end of the module, which will be in December, how they felt this particular tour enhanced their learning. And I'll pass back to you, Zoe, for the bibliography.
Yeah, so as I said before, there isn't that much literature that specifically addresses the question of walking tours as a learning pedagogy, particularly for undergraduates. But here are the most useful things that we found. But if anyone has any other suggestions for other reading, we'd be very interested to hear them. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a brilliant and thoughtful paper. I'm now starting to wonder how to use the area around the university a little bit more in trying to get them to think about kind of like spaces and places and even buildings. So we've got a couple of minutes for questions if anyone would like to ask a question of Zoe and Jill.
I should add that any similarity between my name and the location of Middlesex University is entirely coincidental.
I must admit, personally, I was really pleased to hear that you said that you'd just given them a PDF and they've kind of just gone off like as an analog historian. That sort of sounds really good. So if anyone does have a question, feel free to put it into the chat function or to raise your hand. Otherwise, oh, is the photo voice an easy tool to use?
Oh, so photo voice is a method. Perhaps in the chat I can put a link to that, but you can search and find out about photo voice. But it's very very useful for participative research. Very, you know, arts based, and it's really good for trying to give a voice to people who don't often have a voice. So we were trying to draw on those principles really, but it's a recognised method, and there are some organisations that deliver training courses on this if you're interested. But I really like it. I like photography anyway, but it can help, you know, influence policymakers. It can help bring the voice of people who don't often have their say in a different way. And it's been used, in one example of I'm aware of in my field around housing, for example, is some tenants living in bedsits were asked to take photos of their own accommodation to help them understand what they were faced with and how people acting on their behalf could better understand how they felt about their housing. So it can be a really adaptable and helpful method. I'll try and find a link and put it in the chat if I can.
Brandon.
Hey, thanks so much for that presentation and sharing those exciting and creative exercises about mapping and engaging students. I think you did a really good job of sort of articulating what was unique and creative about the assignment from a pedagogical perspective. I've wondered if you put any thought about how just walking and the activities you described today help students become more creative themselves.
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of evidence, pedagogical evidence that kind of walking as an activity is you know, stimulates the brain, gets your brain working. Being out in the fresh air is obviously great for improving thinking. And so while, as I say, I couldn't find any pedagogical thinking that specifically talked about this kind of local walking tour. But I do think that it was feeding into those kinds of pedagogies around both active learning and walking and learning at the same time, if that makes sense. Does that answer? I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, like a little bit. And, you know, I would also just sort of say the act of walking is creating. Like, there's so much sort of urban studies research and critical theory about how, like, when we're choosing our route, we're making strategic decisions about where we go and, you know, conforming to rules or not conforming to rules. And also in like interpreting the environment. So there's all sorts of opportunities for like creative choice and creative thinking while doing that. So I think that's a really exciting area of research to sort of think about more thoroughly, like what form or specific aspect of creativity is being activated here, and how is it being activated in a really unique and exciting way.
Thank you. Excellent point. Yes.
The idea about interpreting the environment is really key. So as I say, with our students would have previously worked in practice, and that's all gone. So everything is now classroom based essentially. But it's really important they have skills in interpreting what's around them. So I like that little quote. I might pinch that, if that's okay. Interpreting the environment. Thank you. And I like the picture that's coming.
Brilliant, thank you. So our next speaker is Hannah. I don't know if you want to start uploading your slides. Hannah is, I'm really looking forward to this paper. Hannah is only up the road from me in Chester, and she's going to be speaking on doodling and cartography. Yeah, Hannah.
Thank you. I'll just wait for my slides to come up. They're not quite showing on my screen. Right, are they up for everybody? Great, okay. Well, thanks so much to Lucy for organising this panel. It was really interesting to hear that last paper, because I think there's lots of ideas there that intersect a little bit with what I want to talk about as well. A little bit about me then, just to give you some context and sense of who I am and what I do. Are my slides moving? No, there we go. Okay, so I'm senior lecturer in modern history here at the University of Chester, and as of August, I'm also the head of history and archaeology, which sadly takes me away from much teaching this year, and that's why it was really nice putting these slides together yesterday, because it gave me a chance to revisit some of the teaching that I was doing, particularly in the thick of the pandemic, when all of us were probably stretched to be incredibly creative and innovative, and I actually really enjoyed that part of it, even though it was really challenging in other ways. I think exploring the different technologies and thinking about different learning techniques and really having to hone in on that was really useful for me. I'm a historian working particularly on histories of different ethnic minorities, immigrants and refugees moving through and to Britain throughout the 19th and 20th century. And lots of that work, I think about lots of that research I'm thinking about through a spatial lens. The various modules that I offer, you can see here my standard offering for our first, second and third years, also thinks frequently about space and place, and particularly the place and experience of different immigrants and minorities in these urban environments. So it's always a challenge for me to think about how to introduce spatial theory to my undergraduates. And I know in my earlier efforts, I think I probably bamboozled them, overwhelmed them, went into hard and heavy with some of the theorists, and really could just see the look of horror and bewilderment on their faces. So I really wanted to spend some time rethinking, how do we get students to take seriously the concept of space? They're often familiar with thinking about maybe class, thinking about gender, even thinking about race, but space seems to be a whole new concept to them. And it was integral, really, therefore, in my modules that I found some way to really bring that home to them, to think about space in and of its own right as a historical actor. The module that I want to use is a bit of a case study for where I think I've hopefully begun to develop quite a good solution to this problem, is my final year special subject, which I called rather imaginatively Gritty City Urban Wonderland, the Rise of the Modern Metropolis. And I think most of the students come just because they like the title, to be honest, but it's all about marketing, isn't it, with our programmes. And yeah, but then when they arrive, I'm hoping that they enjoy the content as well. It covers broadly British urban history between the 1830s up to the year 2000, and getting them to think about what factors caused the modern era of cities to be born. And within that, we look at different case studies, women, poor, immigrant communities, etc., thinking about how they experience the cities. But I'm also trying to really challenge my students to think about the built environment itself as we move through the module, always to be mindful in what ways the built environment is being deliberately shaped to influence people's lives, people's choices, systems of exclusion, and other such processes as well. So this is really where I needed to get this whole question around spatial theory and how to communicate that so that students are much more mindful of it to them. One of the first approaches that I used in an early iteration of this module was to start by giving them a map, and this is a map that was created, as you can see, in 1845. I think it probably created by Engels in his survey of Manchester, and you can see it's been overlaid later on by a scholar who's looking to try to outline some of the spatial features, thinking about, for example, canals, rivers, street layouts and train lines. And I was trying to use the map in the first instance to encourage students to think about the natural and the man-made routes through urban environments. What were the purposes of these routes? Who did they serve? How were they used? How does this help us better understand the significance of Manchester in 1845 in a regional sense, but also in a national, even in an international sense, thinking about import and export, for example, and trade and a sense of connectedness about Manchester maybe being a node in a wider network. This type of annotated map is useful up to a point. I found that students were able to open up conversations about the urban environment and about Manchester as a city and its various infrastructure, etc. But I think it often fell short of really generating responses which identified the spatial environment as a historical actor in its own right, where the natural features are impacting on the way in which people live in spaces, and equally the man-made features, deliberately or otherwise, having similar impact. So I wanted really to find other methods to try to get students to think about these kind of themes more closely. Probably just before we came into the pandemic era, if we want to call it that, I started to explore some digital resources, such as this bird's eye view of Manchester in 1889, which was created by Henry William Brewer. And it's a map, a digitized map that you can find on the Manchester Library's website. It's a contemporary engraving which offers a panoramic view of the city, but what was nice, because it was digitized, students could go on, they could zoom in, they could zoom out, they could really see the granular detail within this. And it began to offer a few more pedagogic possibilities, because I could use it to encourage students to consider the relationship between art and space, between creative endeavour and the urban environment. I could ask students to think about the motivations for the artist for creating this engraving. What does it reveal about the relationship between people and place? What does it tell us about the subjectivities which lie behind how space is perceived and represented? And how does it help to explain the social construction of spatial environments? And I think by giving students free rein to explore this, perhaps setting it as an activity, that something that I wanted them to do in advance of the class, or by asking them to bring in various devices into the classroom environment, then I found that worked quite well for cementing learning, that they would really take the time to explore this map, to think quite carefully about it. I also found that I needed to try to ground some of this in a sense of historiographical trajectory, particularly when I came to teach this in my final year special subject. And I'm sure, like many of you, during the pandemic, we were being asked to pre-record lectures, which students were then viewing in advance of the much shorter online classes, which were then being offered as a bit of a follow-up. So this is just a screenshot of one of those pre-recorded lectures that I offered, in which I think I tried to map out this historiography. And I'd begun with some key figures within urban history, such as Asa Briggs, for example, whose book Victorian Cities in the 1960s really offered quite a social perspective on urban environments, and then went on to look at other later people like Tristram Hunt in the 2000s, which showed how urban history was opening up to much more general audiences. But I wanted to then use that as a bit of a bridge to go on to talk about how the spatial turn had impacted on the way in which urban history was being written about. using some of these key texts, I thought, which was quite a nice way of getting students to think about the spatial turn. I also, in conjunction with this, and this was a kind of a sort of a secondary thought, was asking students to read a sort of an introductory article on history and the spatial turn, an article that I found by Ralph Kingston called Mind Over Matter, History and the Spatial Turn. And I asked students to read a short section of it, and then I set up a discussion forum through our VLE. We use Moodle, and you can do these kind of things. I'm sure you probably can on whichever platform you use as well. I then asked students to identify a section within that article which really resonated with them, and also a section or a sentence which they found quite confusing. I asked them to then post on this discussion forum and to then open up conversation between themselves to see how far they could help one another to really gain understanding of some of the quite complex concepts that were being discussed in this introductory article. And that was really revealing, actually. And I was particularly pleasantly surprised when I reviewed all of this, when I was looking over it yesterday, at some of the encouraging ways that the students really interacted with each other to help cement their understanding. So one of the students picked out this sentence that you can see in the orange box: spaces do not have meanings, but are only conceived in terms of strategies and tactics. One of them highlighted it because, as you can see in the square box, they found it particularly interesting. It suggests that people do not create spaces related to their own feelings, but instead calculatingly built them with specific purposes in mind. And I think that was a really nice example of a kind of a light bulb moment for that student when they're beginning to see the particular devices which often lay behind urban planning, urban construction, and the shapes that cities and urban spaces take. And the response that received from other students who had initially been confused, but really felt that this was beginning to cement their understanding. Another example of this peer-to-peer learning was when students were grappling with this concept of mental mapping that's defined in the article as the process by which humans begin plotting their actions with reference to an imagined spatial projection of the world around them. And this produced quite a long thread within the discussion forum, which the students went backwards and forwards on this. They're trying to grapple with it. And finally, one of them pulled out an example they thought where this might be applied to London. Let's all think about when we visited London. Maybe we've thought about this space in terms of the sites that were familiar to us, but if you lived in London, you would experience this quite differently. You would move around this environment in quite a different way. And through this process, they started explaining it to one another. So it was just really a nice example, I felt, of peer-to-peer learning in action, where they were really helping each other to begin to get to grips with some quite complicated concepts which underpinned the module. So what I did from this point, and this was a bit on the fly, and I'm sure lots of you, well, maybe you do this or maybe you don't, where you just sort of have great ideas, and this brings me back to the wonderful joy of going for a walk. And I would generally walk into campus and maybe have these ideas on the way in. What can I do with my students? How am I going to get them to understand that article that I've asked them to read, or or this particular source? So I sort of had this idea, well, maybe we could try this, and I gave it this name of doodle mapping. And first of all, I tried this out in the physical classroom in pre-pandemic times, where I was giving students a piece of A3 paper and an extract from a source. In this case, it was from Friedrich Engels, The Conditions of the Working Class. And I was asking them to work in a small group with some nice, colourful pens, and to try to literally translate the spatial descriptions that they were reading in this primary source into a version of a map and see what they came out with. And this produced some really lovely results. I think probably most importantly, it really helped to bond the students together, to do something which felt, quite fun but quite engaging. But it was also getting them to read the text itself at a much deeper level, much more carefully. This process had to go online, of course, over the last couple of years, and so I was searching for a platform that would allow me to do it. And I found this. This is InVision Freehand. I don't know if many of you use this. You probably had your own pet platforms, but I came to quite like this. And this doodle is what some of my final year students did. So don't judge them, because this actually, it might look a bit crazy, but there was actually some really lovely ideas in here. And it wasn't necessarily just the map itself, that was just really the vehicle. It was the conversations that it generated between the students as they tried to decode the text, the extract from Engels, to think about what it was actually describing, but also to try to get to grips with Engels' central argument, which his argument, it was of course now what we would define as a Marxist argument, that he's arguing that the way that the urban environment is designed is intended deliberately to restrict and confine the working classes, to keep them out of view of the middle classes, of the bourgeoisie, that even the commercial districts are designed in such a way that slum quarters are hidden out of sight, so that the bourgeoisie can pass through these spaces without having to encounter the proletariat. And that these kind of doodle maps that the students did collaboratively on teams using this particular platform really helped, I think, to generate some lovely discussion, particularly when we all came back from our breakout rooms to discuss this, and the students explained together the thinking behind this. So quite a light-hearted activity, but it really helped to break down the barriers between the students. Another example, a bit later on in the module, once we'd all got the hand of InVision Freehand, we tried this again a bit later on when we came to talk about the large-scale suburbanisation that took place in many urban centres towards the late 19th century. And you can see the students using it here. And I think we were using this to think about this different process of social mobility and urban planning. But the students also began to introduce some slightly more complicated concepts, more sophisticated things like the racialization of space, white flight from the city. So thinking not just about class, but about race, and about how that creates certain divisions and segregations in urban environments too. So you can see that it's a platform which perhaps isn't particularly friendly if you have great artistic ability, because you have to use a slightly clunky cursor to even draw anything. But it did have some nice features, because you can stick things like post-it notes on there, which allow you to write text and pin that. And when you use it in the classroom, in the online classroom environment, you can take control of it as well as the presenter, pan around the screen, zoom in and out, call on different people that are collaborating in it, and they can participate in that presentation mode as well. Okay, these doodle mapping activities, I think, really help to lay a strong interpretive foundation for the rest of the module. The students grew in confidence using spatial terminology. They became much more aware of spatial processes, influences, and consequences. And I think they came as well to understand the often subtle intersections between urban people and their sense of place. And that played out quite nicely when we came to talk about this map, which might be familiar to some of you. This is Russell and Lewis's Jewish East London map that was produced in 1903 to mark out where Jewish communities, particularly Eastern European Jewish immigrants, were settling in the East End. And it was really pleasing to see. This time, of course, I didn't get them to doodle anything, but just to use the post-it note function on InVision, and to collaborate in putting their interpretations on here, their points of analysis. And when I was looking at this yesterday, I was able to identify the way that they were drawing through some of those ideas that had been laid out in those earlier sessions when we were talking about Engels and we were talking about spatial analysis and mental mapping and things like that. They were drawing it right the way through the module. And I should say that these are 21-week modules. We run full year modules at Chester. So they were drawing it right the way through to a later point, talking about this map, And you can see on one of these post-it notes in the bottom left-hand corner that one of them is talking about how this map has got symmetry with ideas that Engels or observations Engels had made earlier on in Manchester by observations around the way that urban centres and urban districts were used as places for segregation, discrimination and racial prejudice. And they put at the bottom of their post-it note that urbanisation cements us versus them. So there seemed to be a really nice analytical follow through the module. Okay, so just to briefly conclude then, I think just from this small case study, this seems to suggest to me that teaching theoretical concepts effectively benefits enormously from creative approaches. Digital peer-to-peer methods also seem to show themselves as a way for students to feel safe when revealing what they know and what they don't know, perhaps more so than when we do that in a face-to-face environment as well. Applied activities such as this doodle mapping exercise encourages students to read closely, to think more deeply, and it also achieves much more sustained deep learning. These visual digital methods, I think, also enable the participation of diverse learners. And that's something I need to think through a little bit more. That wasn't necessarily anything I was tracking as such, but I think on reflection, that these digital approaches are more effective for a more inclusive approach than perhaps in an in-person environment. And I think just as a final point as well, these cartographic approaches can appeal to students at all stages, including prospective students, because I use a small section of this when I do taster talks during open days and get prospective students and parents to also do their own little doodle map using that text from Engels, and it's quite a really nice little sort of icebreaker activity, and they will come away, I think, hopefully feeling that they've gained some new skills and learned something new about how they can approach history, that it's not just going to be a very traditional text-based approach, but there are more creative ways in which they can learn about the study of the past. Okay, so that's everything from me. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Hannah. That was brilliant, and it was really nice to see some like digital work from the students. And I love this idea of like getting them to use creativity for theory, and that is really exciting. So I don't know if anyone would like to ask a question through the chat box, or alternatively, if you want to put your hand up and speak your question, then please do. Yeah, Miguel.
Hi, thanks so much for that. Very sort of interesting. I suppose I was wondering how you ensured that there was equal sort of participation from all of the students, or whether the class dynamics of some leading and basically some dodging the responsibilities kind of got missed out.
I don't think any of us can deny that happened just as much in the online environment as it does in the classroom, that you had the more natural leaders against those who preferred to stay in the background. But I think anecdotally, using the group breakout function, particularly using smaller groups, tended to help. And I would jump around those breakout rooms, and you would often find there was some quite nice little conversations going if I'd kept it to perhaps 4 or 5 in a group, and those shyer ones would be joining in. I mean, I don't have the answers to how we get those more reticent students to engage, but I do think that by testing out some of these different methods, that does appeal to different learning styles and different learning abilities. And some students actually feel more competent when you ask them to pick up a pen and just do a bit of doodling, than they might if you're asking them to engage in, text analysis or something like that. So, I haven't done any data analysis on any of that, but that would be my kind of anecdotal thinking on it.
Great, thanks. I don't know if anyone else would like to ask a question. In which case we'll move on to Michael, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Greenwich, and he's going to move us from Britain to the Ottoman Empire historically and into the Middle East.
Thank you, Lucy. Let me just get this set up. Is that viewable? Is that my slides all up there? Lovely, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Lucy, and thanks everyone for coming. And it's great to already see some parallels between my thinking and the previous papers. It's almost like Lucy's thought about how she's organised this panel. So yeah, my name is Michael Talbot. I'm an associate professor in the history of the Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East at the University of Greenwich. And I'm just going to talk to you today about some comparatively low-tech, I suppose, methods for creativity within the classroom. So just to give you a sense of the kind of stuff that I teach, and here's a relatively happy looking bunch of my third year students outside the British Museum. Throughout their degree at Greenwich, students can study different aspects of the history of the Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East, starting in the first year, where they encountered the Middle East for the first time alongside other Western European, Asian and African contexts in my Making the Modern World. In the second year, they look at the end of the Ottoman Empire and the making of the modern Middle East after the First World War, the making of nation states in places like Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and so forth. And they can also do specialist projects with me in our amazing core module called History and Practice. And then in the third year, they can do a special subject with me called Cities of the Sultans, which looks at urban social life in the early modern Ottoman Empire. And they can also do dissertation and work placement projects with me on a range of subjects. So one of the things that I kind of wanted to highlight today about the thinking behind my pedagogy when it comes to creativity is all about the empowerment of the students. Being a post-92, we have a range of students from all sorts of backgrounds. But over the years, and I've been teaching at Greenwich now for 7 years or so, over the years I've sort of got lots of data over the makeup of my modules. And on average, between 40 and 45% of my class will be from Black, Asian and other global majority heritage backgrounds. Something between 20 and 25% will be Muslim, and an increasing number of them have been from what I call regional heritage students. So they will be students whose family come from different parts of the former Ottoman realms or the broader Middle East. So people from Greece or Turkey or Palestine or wherever it might be. And so what really I aim to do in my classes, particularly as they move forward towards the third year, is not only to give all of the students the abilities to take ownership of their learning, but encourage those students who have linguistic or faith or cultural connections to the places that we're studying to take leadership when it comes to questions about faith or culture or language, which come up quite frequently in our classes. And so to do that, I've tried to devolve the learning process as far as I can, so that I'm there to facilitate and the students do the majority of the hard work, which also means I can just sit back, have a cup of tea and enjoy the ride. So it wouldn't be a pedagogic session without a convoluted diagram of some kind. So I thought I'd contribute my small part to that. The way in which my classes are structured are in the form of workshops. For the first years, it's 2 hours. For the second and third years, it's 3 hours. They have breaks, I promise you, and it's broken down into bite-sized chunks. They're organised in a riff off of Kolb's experiential learning cycle, which I'm sure quite a few of you will be familiar with. And so before they come to class, the students will have watched some pre-recorded lectures to give some context. They will have read a pretty substantial range of secondary sources, depending on what the subject matter is, and engaged with a number of visual, material and written primary sources. So they've done a lot of thinking already, and they've got key questions that are directly related to activities in class. So there's no surprises when they come into the classroom. But the majority of the learning happens in the next two parts of this diagram, which is the collaborative learning and activity. So to begin with, the students will be broken into small groups. Very often I put them into pre-organized groups. Sometimes they're free to sort of make them up as they go along. Occasionally it's pair work. Usually it's students in sort of 3, 4, 5, 6 groups, and that's where they'll discuss their thoughts on the readings. It's where they'll be able to ask me questions as I sort of hover around the room and get them to think a bit deeper about some of the issues they're raising. And then in the experience part of this, we sometimes, not always, but a lot of the time, will then follow this up with some kind of activity, which is what I'm going to be discussing for the majority of the paper in just a little bit: object handling, role play, and other kinds of creative collaborations. And then once that's all done, we open everything up to the class so that everyone can reflect, come to some conclusions. These conclusions then feed into their assignments, or they feed into what we're going to do in the next class, and so the cycle begins again. It kind of makes sense to me. If it doesn't make sense, please tell me. I think it works with the students. So what I'd like to talk about today is 4 different kinds of creative ways of getting the students to engage with each other and with the material in our classes, starting with object and source handling. Now, there's quite a lot of emphasis in pedagogy recently on visual learners, and that's absolutely the case. I mean, I'll come to that in just a bit. But also the tactile nature of many of the students' learning experiences is something that maybe we as historians, or certainly boring document historians like me, haven't always really thought about. And so over the years, I've sort of, whenever I've been in Turkey or in other parts of the region, I go to flea markets, I go to secondhand bookshops, and I pick up ephemera, I pick up newspapers, I pick up school books and so forth, so that the students, even if they can't themselves go to the region, even if they can't smash into a cabinet in the British Museum or whatever, they can still touch something and handle it without any fears of any repercussions. So, for example, when we study the educational reforms in Abdul Hamid II's Ottoman Empire, they're doing so whilst looking through Ottoman textbooks in all sorts of subjects, from cookery to language to grammar, and also holding the notebooks of students just like themselves from 100, 150 years ago. When we're talking about the explosion of the free press in the second constitutional period, they're able to look through the satirical newspapers, and even if they can't read Ottoman Turkish, which is all of them, because why would you know how to read Ottoman Turkish, they can still look at the cartoons and understand the nature of the satire. And when we look at the modern Republic of Turkey, and particularly when we talk about changing ideas of women and gender roles, they can look through some of the women's magazines from the 1920s, 30s, and a few of them have even stolen some of the knitting patterns for them to kind of see if they can make some 1930s Turkish clothing. So these sorts of objects are things that we can just have in class that they can play around with during the course of the lesson. Then there's more specialized objects. So when students want to do a piece of coursework or a project on a specific aspect of Ottoman or Middle Eastern history, sometimes I can give them some stuff that I've collected over the years that they can play around with. So I've got a collection of photographs and stereographs. They're the creepiest things, right? These are other people's family photographs that I've just found in secondhand bookshops. They're not allowed to be kept in the house, obviously. But for the students, it's fantastic for them to look through and think about the use of photographic sources in their coursework. We then also have things like coins, and you wouldn't expect students to be particularly interested in coins, but amazingly, quite a few projects and really good projects over the years have been done in how we tell stories of change through these little objects. And also, again, thinking about someone from 400 or 500 years ago having handled this little piece of metal and all the history wrapped up in it is a really powerful learning tool. And all of this gives students the confidence to discuss and talk about material sources in ways that I don't think they would probably have if they were just looking at them on a screen, or indeed thinking about them through the glass of a cabinet. And one of the highlights of my third year special subject is when the students come down to the Islamic World Gallery at the British Museum and then write a review of the exhibition, and they then do a primary source podcast based on some of the themes that are there. So all of this feeds in eventually to their assessment, but also gives them the skills, the tools to talk with confidence about sources that are objects. So that's number one. The second is one of my favourites, which is active role play. And this involves a number of different kinds of activities, some of which require my participation, some of which don't. So, for example, when we talk about questions of identity in the modern Middle East, sometimes these are very difficult subjects, and the secondary literature is often very complex and to be perfectly honest with you, not entirely interesting as a read, because the subject is really hardcore. So sometimes the best way to understand it is to act out these things. So when we're talking about the development of new Turkish national identities in the Republic of Turkey, at the beginning of the class, I get the students to undergo the ceremony that Turkish school students for decades and decades and decades had to go through at the beginning of the school day, saluting the flag, swearing the oath of loyalty to Ataturk, and standing to attention for the national anthem. And this is interesting in a number of ways, because some of the students play along, some of them really don't like it. Understandably, some of our students of Kurdish heritage really don't like it. And that then generates huge and really important discussions in the classroom. We also have debates. For example, we recreate the debates of the Ottoman Parliament around minority rights at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. This allows me to don my fez and dress up as the Speaker of the Parliament. Not that I need very many excuses to put my fez on, but this is at least a valid excuse. And then that helps to get the students a bit relaxed for a debate, which can often be quite an awkward thing in the classroom setting. And then the most effective, I think, of these activities is the identities exercise, where I give each of the students an ID card that gives them a religion, a language and a region, and they have to form the biggest, most coherent group out of this multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-religious empire. Purposely, they're done by the population statistics of the late 19th century empire. So there's always one student who gets the rum deal as being the sole Jewish student, for example, in the class, who's always left on the outside. And that says a lot about who gets to be part of the national community and who doesn't. In the third year, things get into a little bit more regular of the active role play. And these are broken down into different categories. So the first, which I call atmospheric, is where you create a mood in the class to get the students in the right frame of mind for the discussion. So next week, we're looking at Ottoman private neighborhoods through bathhouses and coffee houses. So I'm going to be serving them Ottoman coffee, which is modern Turkish and Palestinian coffee, to the sounds of 17th and 18th century Ottoman music. And this will go on throughout the class to create the atmosphere as far as we can of an early modern coffee house. When we talk about the state structures in the 16th century, which are really complicated, we then go on to another kind of role play, which I call illustrative role play. The students use their physical selves to act out or to physically display the state structure of the empire, with the Sultan at the top and all the different officials underneath. And I leave the room for 20 minutes for them to sort that out. And it's usually quite fun to see what they come up with afterwards. And then the third kind is performative role play. So in a few weeks' time, we're going to be thinking about Islamic law and gender roles within the empire. And so the classroom will be turned into an Islamic law court. Based on their readings, I will give them a series of judicial questions, and they will be expected to rule on them as a law court. So there's huge potential within role play to give them creative ways of consolidating their learnings. But there are other ways that are less intrusive, perhaps, and that allow the students to get on with it a little bit more in their own time during class. And these are what I call the creative collaborations, the productions that they come with together through their group work. And these involve low tech, as I said, pen and paper, board markers, whatever it might be. This is my kind of thing, and that's not to diss people who are really good at the digital stuff. I've just found that this is an effective way with the classroom setting for me that works. So sometimes there's very broad briefs that I give the groups. I just want them to illustrate a certain topic, a historiographical problem, the issues around certain kinds of sources. And so they've come up with all sorts of things over the years. I'm just going to whiz through a few of them. That I've got boxes of these things, right? So I just had to rummage through them and pick out some particularly nice ones. So mind mapping is a really common way that our students take notes, even in the digital age. And so it's a great way for them to compare their mind maps and to maybe share their note-taking techniques with their fellow students. And this is a particularly effective and nicely coloured example of a student thinking about 19th century Egypt. But even beyond mind mapping, the activities can allow students with an artistic bent, or students who think they might have an artistic bent, to get a little bit creative in how we visualize some of the big complex issues around some of the historical and historiographical questions that we face. This, for example, again, looks at the same issues in 19th century Egypt, but I think illustrates it quite beautifully in terms of the different aspects of modernity. Some of the most difficult topics that we encounter are around modern ideas, particularly Islamism, jihadism, and all the sorts of things that students may have a lot of preconceptions about. And I found that dealing with these things through activities like creative collaborations can help them to understand it and deal with it in a more sensitive way. So, for example, the ideology of Sayyid Qutb, who is a huge influence on people like Al-Qaeda and other later groups, isn't a very pleasant ideology in many respects. But one of the ways to make sense of it and to deal with it sensitively, I found over the years, has been to try and illustrate it. And this is a great example from a few years ago of a student who was able to deal with questions of anti-Semitism, questions of misogyny, questions, all sorts of questions through illustration. Into the third year, we have more advanced, of course, historiographical concepts that the students have to not only get to grips with, but also critique. For example, the problem of the Islamic city narrative. And so there's different creative ways in which the groups present this using their combined notes and their combined discussions. Sometimes it's a mixture of text and imagery, and this is a lovely example here in which the students have also made clear what their conclusions are and what they feel the problems with this particular concept might be. Others design their illustrations in a way that they can then use to riff off when they are presenting their ideas to the wider class. And this is a really lovely example looking at this idea of the isnad, the intellectual chain that led to this idea of the homogenized Islamic city. And other core concepts that we encounter, again, around public and private space, show the huge amount of reading that the students have done and the huge amount of thinking that they've done in really accessible ways. And that's such a profound skill for the students to pick up, and it takes them a while to realise just what a skill it is to condense several hundred pages of secondary reading and primary reading into a really clear and beautifully illustrated diagram like this one thinking about the coffee house and the bathhouse as social spaces in the early modern Ottoman Empire. And others too might bring in their own experiences to help with the illustrations. This, for example, was inspired by one of the students who'd actually spent some time on a holiday in a public bath in Turkey and used some of the experience that they'd had to help to illustrate the concepts to the rest of the group. Now, just to finish up with these, I've got a few more to whiz through, but I just want to focus on one of my favourite activities, which is understanding and critiquing historiographical concepts of the Ottoman life cycle and particularly the sexual cycle. And there have been some brilliant ones of these over the years in which students have got the confidence not only to show that they understand the complex relationships between men, women and third gender people in the Ottoman Empire, but also to critique generic understandings of it. And one of my favourite examples actually came from during the pandemic, when we obviously had to move all of this onto digital forms. This is a lovely group example where they improvised with images that they found online. And I like this so much that I got it printed off as a t-shirt, because it's just a really great example of how we understand the sexual lifestyle. The final kind of these creative collaborations are group pieces of writing, and these can be in prose, these can be improvised posters, and they can be other kinds of text. So, for example, when we look at early modern Istanbul, I get the students at the end of the class to write a rough guide to Istanbul in which they highlight the pros and the cons of living in the city, and what they would advise travellers to do if they were there. And this feeds in directly to their podcast that they do in terms of their creative assessment, by giving them the tools to think about how they can narrate historical context in an engaging way. These travel narratives as well, when they look at different narratives of Ottoman and European visitors to the empire, they're encouraged to write their own responses to it, picking out some of the key themes from the primary text. And this is a great example in which it was a mixed group of Muslim and non-Muslim students. And throughout the exercise, the non-Muslim students were asking the Muslim students to contribute authentic language and other things from their own experiences to make the travel account sound even better. The final bunch that I want to show you is that our students very often have these creative sides that you just would never know about, particularly when it comes to poetry. And you never think that history students are particularly interested in poetry. At least that was the impression I had as a student. Whereas actually through their love of modern music, particularly of hip hop. Quite a few of them have a lot of engagement with lyrical verses. And so when we, for example, do a class in which we look at advice literature to 17th century sultans, one of the student group's response was to write this lovely little poem that talked about the advice that they would give to a 17th century Ottoman sultan. The vizier has too much power. We saw in Osman's twilight hour the Janissaries put him in the dirt. How Christian slaves can con the caliph of the earth. The corrupted army corps takes wives and fears like rats with the sultan's lives. Place in your court a castrated man and form, inshallah, a power-seizing plan. The time has come to cut their wages, employ the Ghazi, fight for Allah. The Janissaries have had their ages, end their power in the name of Salim, Suleiman and Mustafa. And you need to know the Ottoman context, I guess, to get that, but this just shows how much material they've absorbed to make this beautiful little poem. And we have romantic poetry as well when we look at love, sex and sexuality, a great example of a student using Ottoman meters and literary tropes to write their particular poem. And then one of my favorites, which is a musing on the love lives of Ottoman sultans. Oh, women, semen not heard. When it comes to sex and sexuality, the lines are just blurred. Come out of the mosque feeling divine, off to the palace to drink some wine with my concubines. Always perform my godly duties, but I also still need sex and my wine a bit fruity. Just a wonderful thing by a third year student. Now, finally, and I promise you this is final because I'm conscious of the time, one of the things that I also incorporate into my classes is what I like to call constructive doodling. This is where students, when their energy is down in the class, can do something that isn't looking at their phones or chatting idly with their and distracting their colleagues. And so I give them examples of calligraphy that they are then encouraged to copy and to work with. And this also allows them, once again, the Muslim students and the students with Arabic or Turkish language heritage to take some leadership in giving advice on techniques, in teaching the alphabet to their colleagues. And some of the things that the students have produced over the years have been really fantastic. These are my favourite ones, for example, from the third years, looking at early modern calligraphic forms. So just to conclude, what is the value in all of these seemingly frivolous activities? Well, it's obviously for my entertainment above all else, but seemingly the students do seem to get quite a lot from this. And over the years, I've developed and improved upon the collaborative techniques based on the feedback that the students have given me. Some of the keywords that come up again and again in the feedback is that they find group work and creative activities engaging, helping them to understand things, helping them to consolidate learning, making it easier to retain information. They love working with each other. They love learning from each other. And one of my favourite ones here, the 3-hour workshop and the group work helped me get the most of the course from both Michael and my peers. And I just think that's a beautiful thing. And then the last slide, I promise. Thank you for your patience, Lucy. The main thing, the three things that I think I'll take away from this creativeness is, number one, the confidence building that it gave students who'd never studied the Middle East before to talk about something with real confidence and with real authority. The second is that it gives my students from Middle Eastern and Muslim backgrounds a place in our classrooms. And this line always moves me from the second piece of feedback here. It's not something that's generally taught in schools. And for the first time in my education, we were talking about people like me. And I just think that's a wonderful thing to hear. And then the last one, I like it when primary sources such as magazines, postcards and coins are brought to class. It makes me feel like a genuine historian. So the aim to empower students in their learning, hopefully coming across there. Thank you for your patience. Sorry for jabbering on over time. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. Those quotes are just so lovely, and they've really obviously given so much thought about what they're going to write and say in their module feedback and evaluations, which is just great. Once again, I'd just like to open the floor up to people. Oh, I don't know if this is. Oh no, I'm sorry, I thought someone had just put their hand up, but if anyone would like to put their hands up or alternatively put some questions. Oh, Saria.
Hi, I think I'm unmuted there. So I come from a very different background. I'm also still a PhD student, so I am more recently student than professor, we'll put that way. And I love the emphasis on kind of collaboration and group work and all that sort of stuff. But as someone who works a lot with colonization and a lot of like very difficult history, how do you walk the line when you're doing role playing between making sure that people don't go into stereotyping or alternatively like over dramatizing and fictionalizing like people's real trauma? And I don't know much about the Middle East, I'll be honest, so I can't speak to the context of your class. I'm just thinking about applying it to my own work, what your kind of advice is on trying to make sure that you can still educate and engage, but not necessarily other or, I don't know, make light of in a way. And I know that's not what you're intending to do, but hopefully that makes some sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's a really important point. I mean, part of it is knowing when stuff is appropriate to role play and when it's not. So when we're talking about the Armenian genocide or the Palestinian Nakba, that's not a time for this sort of activity. That's when we have serious empathetic discussions about this stuff. But as with the identity activity, where by the end of it, there's a big group of Muslims, there's a smaller group of fractious Christians, and then there's the one student who's the Jew at the end. That then leads into some pretty serious discussions about what that means. And invariably, the student who gets the Jewish ID card is not themselves a Jewish student. And then that leads to a discussion about how far one empathizes. In terms of the stereotyping, most of our jobs as Middle East historians is to fight against stereotyping, both in the historiography and in the classroom. And so lots of what they do in their activities is geared to that. So the Islamic city narrative, for example, is basically how Western historians have created an agrabah, right, of how we think about Middle East urban spaces that was so influential in historiography for like half a century. And so their job is to, through engaging in the stereotyping, fight against the stereotype. Yes, this says that all Middle East cities look like Aladdin. But actually, when we look at our Ottoman context, we know this, and this. So yeah, it is a fine line, but it's choosing the right topic. And it's also, I think, trusting the students that if they do start to go down that road, other students will pull them up. And that's, again, where leadership from students from the faith and cultural heritage can become really important. I hope that answers your question. Yeah,
I was pretty confident you were not role-playing the Armenian genocide, so I was good at that point. But no, thank you. I think, yeah, it's an interesting line. So hearing someone who's done a lot of it, it absolutely does answer. Thank you very much.
Brendan.
There we go. Thanks. Thanks for the lovely presentation and showcasing a variety of strategies of creative engagement in the classroom. I'm wondering, given the broader creative churn and sort of emphasis on leveraging higher education to sort of underwrite growth in the creative economy, if you've ever conceptualized these pedagogic strategies as almost like a form of prototyping or something like that, because it seems like from how you were talking, it's like students are making conceptual prototypes in order to better understand the subject matter and also take ownership of the concepts as well. So I'm just curious if you've ever sort of framed it that way or sort of engaged with sort of research on prototyping.
No, it's not something I'm aware of, and actually I would be interested from you while you're on the line to hear a little bit more what you mean by prototyping. It's not something I've come across. Okay, so like one of the weird things that happened with the creative economy is that like business people stole a lot of strategies from art and design. So like in innovation context now, it's really common for people to do improv, to make rapid prototypes with just whatever materials are available, using like Play-Doh, Lego, or quick sketches and stuff like that. So the point of like these rapid prototypes isn't actually make like a functioning model of a product or a service, but it's rather to make sure that everybody who's collaborating on the team really understands like the key attributes or information that's being shared. And more, this is sort of really aligning with how people are talking about critical making.
as a sort of an activity that you can do to better understand a subject matter. So like in critical making, usually people do a lot of secondary research. They come together and they make a thing. So depending on the context, it could be, it was originally in technology studies, so they'd make little quick circuit boards, but other people that are for like making zines or knitting or anything you can think of. And the prototype you make sort of expresses the ideas and helps you sort of further clarify them and then explore them. And one of the key components is that everybody edits the prototype as you go along so that it changes to reflect how the thinking has changed. So I think that's like the quickest way I could summarize it, but that's sort of how people have been talking about it, both in terms of like in business administration, but also in some humanities discourse as well.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing. I shall explore that further. Much appreciated.
So our last speaker is Katherine, and am I right? Have I remembered this correctly that you're joining us from Canada, aren't you? Is that right? Yeah. So we're off to Canada now in our virtual world, where I'm sure it's really early in the morning. But Katherine's going to be talking to us today about using like objects and sort of like unsettling colonial oppression and heritage in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you. It's actually surprisingly not a bad time here. It's just coming up to lunchtime. So for as far as my European conferences have gone, this is really nice. I've done 5 a.m. So this is great. Thanks. And thank you to all of you who are joining at the end of your day, because that takes a lot as well. So it looks like my slides are slowly making their way. Does it look okay? Yes. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to be talking a bit about some themes that have already been introduced, which is fantastic, but thinking about how we talk about unsettling history and archaeological practice, particularly in colonial histories and the legacies of those, as Canada widely reflects at this point. So I'd like to begin actually with an acknowledgement of the land on which I'm situated this morning, and virtually now I'm dragging you all into it as well, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people, or Mohawk people. And it's a place that has for a very long time served as a site of meeting and exchange and sharing between very diverse nations. So it's one that has a lot of points of connection to lots of different people through time. And this is really important to framing my point of view and my experience as a white settler in these spaces, and one who's actually only been living in this territory for about coming up to 5 years now. So it's one that influences a lot of how I've experienced and understand these things, but then also how I look at teaching them as well. And for many of us in archaeology and history and all the tangentially related fields that connect into it, I think a lot of us are only beginning, unfortunately, to really think about the legacies of colonialism for historical and archaeological practice, and the ways that connects into our not only our research, but also our teaching as well. And we're looking at a lot at how we reshape education and training in archaeology to better reflect narratives relating to colonialism, reconciliation, decolonizing narratives as well, and how we look at that. For archaeology, our very existence is really born out of colonialism, so it's one that's difficult to also separate from. And since I'm someone who teaches specifically public archaeology, which is a lot related to how we communicate archaeological knowledge with large publics, with communities, but also engage them in the practice of archaeology. I find this really fascinating because the kind of birth of archaeology is a very kind of public engagement with the past. Here in Canada, it was very common on a nice Sunday afternoon after church to go and dig up sites that were known in the area. And the sense of kind of ownership of the past really developed, in which people had large collections of objects that were stolen from Indigenous lands. And these are kind of the births of a lot of the museums in Canada as well, and across the world now as well, since a lot of you are joining from British context. There's that connection there as well. But thinking about how that shapes our sense of almost stewardship of these objects gets discussed a lot in archaeology, that we're preserving them for some future generation to connect with. Preservation is a big one, but also realizing over time that that's not actually an appropriate relationship to a lot of these objects. So I have an image of totem poles, for instance, which are fairly common in northwest coast of Canada, but a lot of them were created very much with the sense that they weren't supposed to be preserved forever. They were wooden objects placed in very wet locations that were supposed to decompose over time, with the sense that they would then open up space for something else to be put there. So when you put them in a museum and you halt that process, what is the impact for the object, for the community? So, but it's difficult for archaeologists also to let go of that idea of preservation. So it's the one that we're grappling with a lot, I think, as across the discipline. But when we also start looking at how archaeology and history is presented in public spaces, you can see the kind of knock-on effects of some of these very colonial frameworks for our practice. So this is one of my favorite pieces of public art in Montreal, which is in a subway station here, but it's representing the history and the creation kind of around Montreal. And you can see it's a very homogeneous view of the world. I will point out that there's only 2 women. I'll give you a moment to see if you can find the women who are there. I will also zoom in because that's how difficult they are to find. Oh, my zoom element is not popping up. Well, that's not helpful for you all now, is it? Well, you'll have to pull out your little magnifying glass. They're in the little grouping of people to the side. Maybe I can actually, ooh, look at the technology. There's 2 women holding babies, and that's how we can identify them as women also. But otherwise, it's all a bunch of white men in different roles. So when you also think about Indigenous representation, Black representation, which is all fundamental to the history of Montreal, you just see in public spaces that it's not really represented at all. And in a lot of ways, what's celebrated on monuments is actually really disastrous and deeply concerning for a lot of people. And so this is one of the most central monuments that represents colonial history in Montreal. And there's a panel that actually shows a European man killing an Indigenous man very visually on the monument, and to think about also how that affects Indigenous people who live and work in this area of Montreal, that they have to pass by that every day. There's growing demands to really think about how we're representing this. So a lot of work then is being done with thinking about how we challenge these narratives, how we reshape them, how we work them, but then also how that gets presented in the long term in public environments for also transforming attitudes that we see in contemporary society, because certainly there's a lot of ongoing racism, which continues to be a big problem. So thinking about that, but then also how do we teach students in these methodologies that are also in evolution, and think creatively about that practice. So before I get into how I've gone about that, I figured since this is a creative history format, I'm also going to force you all to be creative today, because that's what you can do in these environments. So my challenge for you, hopefully you can find yourselves a piece of paper, or you can do this digitally, since we've seen some digital means of doodling also today. Your mission is to create an image of what creative history means to you, and you can be inspired by what we've seen today or other parts of this conference, or your own practice or experience. You can also go far outside of the image and do poetry or creative writing, whatever feels good for you. But that's your challenge before the end of the presentation. I'm completely fine with seeing you all multitask for the rest of my presentation. That will take a lot of pressure off. So in my classrooms, a lot of the topics that we're coming into thinking about and the complexities of introducing not only theoretically, but also methodologically quite challenging issues. We talk more and more about decolonization of archaeology and what decolonizing heritage actually looks like in practice, because for a long time it's been certainly a buzzword and something very nice to talk about, but the practice of it is one that continues to be a huge obstacle. So I think in starting to see the contours of heritage for our century, our generation, whatever you want to conceive it of us, we start to see a lot more discussion of actually addressing inequities, exclusion, control, and discrimination, and the ways that it's actually deeply embedded in archaeological research, but also the laws that govern archaeological research, because archaeological research is fundamentally framed by laws about how and when archaeology is done. You have to have license to do it. It's all very much structured by a legal framework. Also connections into education and curriculum, which has been a huge limitation for how the general public learns about the history of colonialism as well. And access to information, so more open access, more efforts to make access to things like museums or other spaces to learn about this history, something that is more accessible for a wider number of people. So in that, and hopefully decolonizing methods aren't completely foreign to you, but one thing that I do want to highlight is the emphasis that is placed particularly by Indigenous communities defining decolonization. The emphasis really is on non-Indigenous individuals, but also governments and institutions like museums and universities to create space and support for Indigenous peoples to reclaim what was taken from them. And I think this is a really interesting framework, especially if you're trying to draw parallels or connections to archaeology, because we really are talking about a lot that has been taken from Indigenous people in terms of objects being ripped out of traditional territories, but also connections to that history and knowledge of that history. So how do we actually allow communities to reclaim all of that through things like repatriation, but also research that is more engaged in oral history and things like that. This is creating a bit of a nebulous world of kind of public history, public archaeology, citizen science, collaborative methodologies, advocacy work, outreach work, inclusivity work in archaeology and history that's creating what often gets termed as like kind of a new branch of archaeology in which I sit. So the rest of my presentation is going to be based on how I teach this nebulous world, particularly in the context of a third-year undergraduate course at the University of Montreal, which is focused on public archaeology, particularly through collaborative methodologies. So at this point in a lot of students' kind of educational path at the university, they've already taken a huge number of courses in traditional archaeological methods, kind of how to excavate a site, how to analyze objects in the laboratory, but also kind of, I'll call them more history classes of like learning about different points in the whether very distant past of like learning about Neanderthals to learning about more recent people through material objects. So they've already got all of this on their kind of tool belt and knowledge. So then it's a question of how we learn about shifting some of the, I would say, bad habits that we've learned as archaeologists, but also thinking about communications in particular through collaboration and public education. So they get introduced to a lot of different frameworks for thinking about collaboration, such as knowledge braiding, which is a really fruitful one for thinking. I like it in particular because the sense of braiding together diverse strands of knowledge from Indigenous communities, from archaeologists, etc. It's one that's very kind of makery in itself. It's very active. You're creating something with all these different strands. There's also a kind of an intimacy of braiding. If you've ever braided someone else's hair, there's that kind of connection to it. So I really like it as a framework for not only visualizing these things, but it leads nicely into kind of creation and creativity based methodologies. So we talk a lot about collaborative histories to address colonialism. So ideas of collaborating with more diverse communities rather than archaeology, which is fundamentally has been a very non-diverse community, largely, and continues to be demographically not a very diverse group of people. So how do you expand that, whether through training or whether through engagement with people in other fields? Reshaping how we see the past and recognizing other ways of knowing and other epistemologies, and then ensuring that this historical knowledge and education and programming kind of branches out from there. And then I connect this in my course to creative histories, in particular, the idea that often we need to make something with what we're doing, particularly for the communication side of things. You get into creative media as you get into creative approaches like applications of augmented reality or whatever. It's very creation based and creative based. I draw a lot on kind of knowledge and theory relating to makerspaces, which have historically been very grassroots based, very much based in kind of knowledge sharing or democratization of access, disruption of structures of kind of capitalism and things like that, and then also creative innovation to kind of structure how we're going to go about this. And I think it's something that we see more and more in the archaeological literature as well. People looking for more creative communication, more generative approaches, but also the idea that creative skills can be a way of addressing the disempowerment that we see in a lot of heritage environments like museums. But I think also if you spend a lot of time teaching undergraduates, I'm assuming there's similarities in terms of student culture across the waters, but I'm seeing more and more kind of a sense of disempowerment also from students. So how you kind of empower them and think about that. And I would agree with some of the other papers today that creativity and these kind of creative engagements open up a lot of opportunities for empowerment. At the same time, I also see a lot of sometimes backlash against it because people lack confidence in creative engagement. I find that particularly at the University of Montreal. I was previously at a university that was kind of known for a very artistic student body, and people were like willing to try anything. Current student body that I work with have a lot of kind of baggage of feeling like they're not artists, they're not people who should be drawing things whatsoever. And maybe you all who are over there drawing at this moment can relate to that as well. I understand. I also get nervous when I draw. So how you kind of break that ice and let them feel okay in the environment as well. It's usually a baby step process, and thinking about how you can kind of build in the complexity into these activities as well to make sure that they don't become something that's too simplified. So most recently, I've started experimenting with the creation of zines relating to teaching decolonizing practices in archaeology, which is interesting in itself, because if we think about the history of zines, they do kind of emerge at times with this idea of kind of being a bit of an alternative source of publishing and being a bit counterculture and things like that. So that aspect of or the spirit of that aspect can be really interesting for playing with zines. And there's a really interesting tradition also of zines in archaeology and heritage environments, which I like to dredge up and use as kind of artifacts rather of our kind of past of zining in archaeology. Fun note is that zines are becoming less and less common in the students' mind as something, and I feel like I'm starting to like date myself by my kind of nostalgia for zines, but it's good to introduce them to the world of zines if they've never seen them before. So in the beginning of the course, they essentially craft a zine, which there's a little diagram there of how you can quickly make a zine out of folding and cutting paper. So they fold and cut a paper to create a zine that's about 8 pages long. And then they go through different activities to fill those pages over time. So one of the first activities is to kind of critically reflect on their own point of view and position themselves, which is fairly common in the zine world, to have kind of a positioning statement or an introduction to the author. So we look at some examples of what that might look like, and we talk about how they see themselves and how they think that might influence their point of view as an archaeologist. And then we try to craft an appropriate kind of self-portrait almost through that. More and more, I'm doing kind of a underlying activity to kind of prepare students, where they fill out a survey relating to kind of recognizing their own privilege, and then we kind of talk through that, and then we kind of build steps towards this so that they kind of develop a more complex view of their kind of own position before creating the zine, and that kind of gives us more of those baby steps towards it. Then we go into more storytelling mode of treating different topics on different pages, but through storytelling practices. And many elements of storytelling are actually really relevant to thinking about decolonizing narratives of archaeology. So the basic kind of ingredients of thinking about setting and landscape and people and characters and temporality and things like that are actually really important topics. So temporality has a deep connection to thinking about continuity of cultures, which is broken very heavily in colonial history. We tend to present Indigenous cultures as past and kind of ancient, that sort of thing, even though there's this long continuity. Thinking also about linear stories, which is more common in Western storytelling, versus cyclical or nonlinear stories, which is more common in Indigenous storytelling, and how that might influence how we understand the past that is being presented. Also with the landscape, the importance of traditional territories and the connection to territory. How do we represent that in storytelling? Characters and people is thinking about multivocality and how we interweave that into storytelling. But also thinking, and this is a really important one for archaeology, is thinking about how we actually incorporate evidence and data into our storytelling, because there's a huge issue with pseudo-archaeology and these representations of the past that are actually deeply problematic. So how do we ensure that the general public also understands through our storytelling like what it is to craft like an appropriate history that's connected to data, that's connected to real information rather than just kind of imaginings of aliens and things like that. So all of these things are actually really useful for talking about really particular points in public archaeology and education, as well as this principle of kind of decolonizing and reshaping narratives. And at the end, once they've gone through the exercise of all these different topics and subject matters and developing stories that really focus in on characters or focus in on territory, we have a final page where they actually create a glossary for their zine, where they actually go back, reread everything that they've crafted, and think about, is there word choices that they either want to change now that they've thought about it a bit more, which they can go back and just erase and change it, or do they want to explain why they're using a particular word? And sometimes this is also kind of a peer review process where they look at each other's zines and point out words that they don't understand in someone else's zine, or think that someone might need an explanation for. And we think about how to explain those terms in more detail. So it's kind of a huge process. They go through these activities, usually step by step over a few weeks, to build their little zine and treating all these different topics. In the long term in the course, they usually use this as a launch pad for then prototyping exhibits, some of which have in real life been created in museums, some of which remain imaginative, or creating, in some cases, digital apps, particularly when you're more in digital learning environments. As more creating digital apps or programming that could be shared through the internet world. But thinking, once we've created this sense of storytelling, how do you then apply it to different formats in archaeology, whether it's the museum exhibit or a social media campaign or something like that? And then finally, more and more as I think about these things, we're playing with a bit more of how we balance what is kind of creative and playful, and you want kind of to have that energy and joy in classrooms as well. And this connects back to the discussion between Sierra earlier and Michael. But how do you actually address that in really challenging or dark historical topics while integrating the appropriate level of respect for them? Because a lot of what we're all looking at is is very complex, but also that students have a very particular connection to that history. The majority of students are either Indigenous or settler. How does that experience play out? The ways that they also have emotional ties to the history that's being told, to ensure that there's the appropriate level of respect, but also space for their emotions over time. And so we have a lot of discussions about care. We have a lot of discussions about emotion and why actually creative methodologies are sometimes really appropriate for this, because they have the space for emotional discussion that sometimes the kind of average academic paper doesn't allow for. Empathy is a huge discussion that we have. How do you display empathy? How do you display kind of this kind of authentic engagement with decolonizing practice through creative practices? But also very much there's more and more students, of course, who are really looking at activism and disruption more and more. So how do you actually think about these things and its role in archaeology? But I think from there, once you start to see kind of the applications of the tools in creative practice and build confidence in them as well, there's this sense that students start to see how they could use it to reshape how they're using archaeology, or how they're seeing archaeology's position in the world, since it is a hugely kind of privileged position to be an archaeologist. We're not going to be kind of solve cancer or something like that, but like, what is the role then for contemporary society, and how do we ensure archaeology is doing that? So you can see their brains, especially once you get to the exhibits, like, or the assignments that are more like exhibits and things like that, they're starting to think about, what is it I actually want to change in the sphere of heritage, or how it's presented, or people's mindsets about these histories, and how do I do it? So it kind of gives that door opening moment of thinking about how you can reshape things. So coming all full circle back to your little mini mission at the beginning of the paper, my original, oh, I didn't update the slide because I changed the theme. Don't freak out if you didn't use that theme of collaboration. I changed it to creative histories. But I wanted to use this to kind of create a collective zine for those who are interested in it. So anyone who wants to share, but I'm also understanding if you're too panicked to share. I'm sure they're all beautiful, but it's a very personal thing. If you do want to share, you can email your image or whatever you created to Katherine.cook@umontreal.ca, and then I will craft a zine with them and then send it back to all of you. So you're agreeing to be sharing with other participants as well, if you're okay with it. But I thought it might be a fun exercise to see how other people are also thinking about creative history, and also if no one has questions about my paper, we can also just have a sharing session of what people have created too, because I'm more curious in that almost. But yeah, so that's that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. That was a really enjoyable paper and really thought-provoking. And I did do it, my craft. I did do it in class. Thank you very much. I've impressed myself. That's all that matters right now. So I'm really happy to open the floor up to any questions that anyone might have. Once again, either in the chat function, or you can put your hand up and speak.
If nobody has a question, I'm happy to share my doodle. So I don't know if this is on mirrored right now, but I'll hold this up. Yeah, it is mirrored, unfortunately. So this is a sketch about Sheridan College, which is on unceded land in 3 places, in Oakville, Mississauga, and Brampton in Ontario. And part of what I was sort of thinking was about how to indigenize Sheridan, and particularly its history. And with the sketch here is our mascot is Bruno, Bruno the bear. So here's a quick little sketch of Bruno. And Bruno has absolutely no relationship at all to Sheridan or history, anything like that. Somebody liked the bear, so that's how we ended up with it. And I was thinking, well, how might we indigenize our mascot there? So I have a Haida Bruno sort of quickly mapped out. And then beside that, I have another one here thinking about a logo for the duelers. because we're actually named after Richard Sheridan, Irish playwright, politician, a famous historical figure who was had 2 duels in his lifespan. One of them, the gun didn't work and his sword was broken, so he lost that one, and then they had a make-up duel where he almost died in the duel. So I thought, well, duelers might be a better and slightly more appropriate logo, if still a little colonial and completely unrelated to the institution. And then the last one is just sort of about the Treaty of One Spoon, which governs some of the lands that Sheridan College is sat on. So I was like, well, maybe we can further indigenize our branding and logo by making reference to the treaties or reconciliation or something like that. So like that for me was just sort of like mapping out how the process works and sort of how that collaboration and making things can help sort of facilitate thinking. So that's what sort of inspired me, especially when you showed those first pictures at the beginning. I think, were those Ambrose Small photographs from Toronto next to the Museum of Civilization? So yeah, I was sort of inspired by that and went with it.
Thanks for sharing. Fun fact, I grew up in Burlington, which is the next town over from Oakville, so very familiar with Sheridan and also some of that history. But yeah, thanks for sharing. That was fun. Fun to see. Any other sharers of beautiful artwork or? Ooh. I like the flash of images going across the screen.
I have no art ability, so I literally went preschool and traced my own hand. But
as someone who has a toddler, I do a lot of hand tracing, and I can appreciate the complexity of that skill watching a toddler try to do it. So well done. Also, what I always try to kind of tell my students when they're having panic about artistry and things like that is that a stick figure can tell a lot of information. So well done on rocking the stick figures.
So I don't know if anyone has any questions for Katherine or alternatively for the speakers that are here and they'd like to ask anything. It's always really one of those weird things where it's like you don't know if someone's typing, so you don't know how long to pause for. But I'd just like to say that. Yeah, go for it, Katherine. Sorry.
Okay, I don't want to cut you off, but I actually had a question that I was conceiving of for Michael's presentation, mostly because I am deeply in awe of everything presented. But I was wondering, it seems like so many activities and really impressive programming, but how much time would you say you invest in developing this kind of curriculum? And also, is it a lot of time to maintain it? Like, what are the realities of being a professor and teaching such a wildly creative, well, really series of courses relating to this?
How much time do you spend on your classes? I mean, I think
a lot, but
yeah, I think it really matters what you do in it. I mean, we all have our learning outcomes, right? And we all have what we want the students to get, and everything in between, I think, takes about as much time as anything else. And you've clearly got enough creative stuff going. I mean, all your activities must take. I mean, how did you try yours out? I mean, how long have your activities taken to develop? Because it's more that sort of long term rather than hours, isn't it? It's years of trying and testing, isn't it?
Okay, so they're developed over time, because I was very deeply impressed by like the range of them. I feel like I have at the moment very small courses and particular courses in which I have these things in, but I don't feel like they fit together yet in the way that you have.
I also have the benefit of being like the only Middle East scholar in the village, so I can kind of get away with what I want to. Whereas, I mean, but do you work collaboratively, for example, with other colleagues in other modules where you might be able to develop these things more broadly across the offering?
Somewhat. I'm fairly new at my institution, so maybe I need to explore that more. That's very interesting. I should think about that.
Yeah, it was really interesting because in the last session we had, somebody actually spoke about how they have a creative practitioner, and that's part of their like faculty and school. And I was thinking that's so amazing, because actually sometimes that's what you kind of need, is someone who has that kind of technical know how to do a lot of that kind of making. And that's where it perhaps feels like we're kind of like novices or kind of experimenting quite a lot, when it would be good to have kind of like support in other angles. But I definitely, I know that we're coming to the end, but I definitely want to say I found all of the papers I've heard today really stimulating, and I feel like I'm going to do some really bad poaching of like seminar activities from everybody. But it was really great to hear your papers, and thank you so much for coming and attending as well. Yeah, our oh, I should also plug our next session. Unfortunately, my colleague who's normally here, who's much better organised and much better at introducing people than I am, was unable to come. So I'll put in the chat function the link. But for those of you that don't know, this is a series of workshops that have been run between September and December. Our next session is going to be on the 29th of November, and it's going to be looking at creative objects, in particular books and on comics. I'll put the link in here so you can sign up. But there's also videos in this webpage to the last 2 sessions, and I'll be putting the video up of this session as well. But thank you so much, and let's do our virtual round of applause, like either physically or with the emoticon. It's so weird now, isn't it? But thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much, and see you again. Okay, bye.
That was such a great paper. Thank you. I will be. I'm definitely gonna steal that. I thought that was just such a lovely, because I've never even thought about trying to get them to do their own self-guided walking tour before. So that's just really great and fascinating.
Or you could get them to make up their own tour locally, and less on you.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
wouldn't that be lovely?
But we've been very pleased how it worked. It was a huge amount of years and years, I suppose, of information and knowledge, but we enjoyed it. So I think it's very adaptable, and you could I'm sure find something in your area too. I have no doubt.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, but thanks very much for the opportunity. We enjoyed doing it.
Thank you.
And I'm loving this picture.
Oh, thanks.
From Josh.
Yeah, I'll share it. I'll share it with you and Zoe.
Lovely.
Once we get the JPEG, so you can have a look at it.
Oh, so I really like that, and how he was doing it while we were all talking.
I know,
as well.
it's so
Fantastic.
great, isn't it?
Clever, very clever. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, and see you again. Bye bye.